coming out. I think this is the largest group we've had for our public debates. I'd like to acknowledge all the embassy people who are here, all the ambassadors. Thank you for coming. And if there are any officials, as they say, protocol observed. Thank you everyone for coming. We're going to start off quite soon. I just want to tell you that yesterday we had some living legends at the museum. One of them was Dr. Don Matera, Bra Don as he's commonly and affectionately known. And he's given me permission to use some of his words, which I'd just like to quickly read to you. It says, God willing, I've prayed for all my families. Now my focus is on all the scarred people of South Africa who are hurting deeply inside, while others kill one another, kill women and children. We are told that accurate racism, tribalism, ethnicity, greed and hatred against whites, blacks, colors, Indians and foreigners is growing fast and furiously in South Africa, including intra-tribal murders. The police force has been sorely targeted countrywide. Some say that our country is on a tumultuous brink of collapse soon. But some of us caringly say it is time for the healing, time for the people to wake up and change the national mess inside and outside of our people, in order to save our children of today and tomorrow from the grim, growing internal pessimism and acrimony sweeping across the beloved country. From Dr. Don Matera, the Bard of Compassion and Liberation. Welcome and thank you. Thank you. I will just introduce Eusebius Makaiser, and he will introduce the panel. I'd like to say that again, thank you to the panel for participating today. Thank you again, Eusebius, for moderating. Eusebius, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is a journalist, a broadcaster, an author, amongst many other things. He's also a political, social commentator, and I'm sure you've heard him on the radio, and he's also been a moderator for our public programs over a period of about 2.5 years now. And we appreciate his insights and the skill that he brings to these sessions. Thank you, Eusebius.
Thank you, Eddie. Testing. Is this testing 1, 2. Is this on? Yeah, I'm just going to stand up. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's debate, and I want us to get straight into it, really. It is the biggest debate that we've had so far in terms of public interest and media interest, and Wade and I were trying to reflect on why that is the case, and we're not quite sure, we're just speculating. I think there's a couple of reasons, and I want to make 3 points shortly by way of framing the debate, and then we will get into it. The process for this afternoon is very simple. We've got 4 excellent panelists. Each one of them will have 7 minutes to make opening remarks, no more. After that, it is over to you. And we're going to finish by sometime between 4:30 and 5 o'clock. I know it will be very difficult. Everyone wants to have a say. This is a very important, but also a very provocative title that we have chosen, and deliberately so. But many of you have traveled far. You will need to go back to your places. And we have a very unorthodox success criterion for our events. If you feel as if the event should have gone on longer, we take that not as a diss, but as a sign that it was a success. So we will wrap it up quite neatly. You're most welcome to stay behind. There's some drinks and some snacks. And a lot of people often have their most honest conversation, not during the formal part of events, but often during the informal sessions as well. But I really would like to welcome you for being here today. It's a public holiday, although an important one. Many people often rightly choose the opportunity to have a little bit of a break from the dreariness of everyday work. So thank you so much for coming out to this incredible space, which is a really apt space as well for this kind of topic to be debated in. First and foremost, I want to introduce all of my panelists. We have carefully selected all of them for very specific reasons. In my head, I've played Sangoma, trying to predict where each of them will position themselves. I will tell you at the end whether I turned out to be correct, whether I know their work as closely as I do. From my immediate right and then all the way to the far right, which has nothing to do with their ideological positioning. First and foremost, I want to introduce Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. Sizwe is well known in South Africa as one of our best new no longer emerging, but actually already an established voice on social and political discourse. Him and Karima already had a vigorous debate about the EFF in the holding room. And Sizwe, of course, is a doctoral candidate in international relations at Oxford University. He's already got his master's degree from Oxford with distinction, might I add. So he is an academic. He's also a rap artist, and he is someone who cares deeply about activism and about justice. Can we please welcome Sizwe to this discussion? Okay, next to Sizwe we have Karima Brown. Karima, if there is a job in media, she has done it. She has been a media executive in charge of at least 18 titles at independent media. She has been a founding editor of a magazine, Forbes Women Africa. She has worked as a political editor at Business Day. She is the host of the Karima Brown Show currently on 702. She's a political analyst. She's one of our veteran political reporters in the country. And she's even worked before at the SABC in many jobs. So she really has an incredible pedigree, and she is truly, in that modern parlance, someone who is platform agnostic and who pushes her political journalism across many platforms and has done so, quite frankly, for several decades, and a very important voice. Can we please welcome Karima as well? Next to Karima, I am particularly excited, not that the other three don't excite me, but I speak to them more often than I do Lebogang Pheko. Lebogang is, I think, one of our fiercest, in the good sense of the word, minds in the country. Absolutely brilliant. She has a background in law as well as in public policy. She is the founder of a management consultancy. She is excellent on economic policy as well as the interpretation of data to try and make sense of both economic and social policy in this country. She is one of the best and most natural debaters you can get, as Mr. Fasagi found out when he tried to touch her on her studio. And if it was up to me, we would all hear from Lebogang every week in a public platform. And it is almost a rare treat that she's here. I suspect many of you are here, particularly because she's here. Can we please welcome Lebogang Pheko? And then last but not least, we have Sela Hatang, who of course is the CEO of the Mandela Foundation, Nelson Mandela Foundation. He is an absolutely fascinating, energetic South African. If he is not hiking or running up the Westcliff stairs, he's busy giving my colleague Stephen Groothuis trouble about the old South African flag. Selo's background is in history, like many of us. Selo's life, in terms of where his adult life took him, began with a teacher that is a touch point in your life. In his case, it was a history teacher. He wanted to become a history teacher, but thought he won't make much money. But he did study, nevertheless, archival science, and that took him to the South African archives, where he's done incredible work. That's also where his interest in Madiba as a subject, both Madiba, the myth, and the historical man, started in between his work with the South African Human Rights Commission to try and make sure that their work and profile is better understood in the country. And now, of course, he has a deep interest as a commentator in his own right, not just as the boss of the Mandela Foundation. And I think that his work in particular, although he's very prominent, I think it's also underappreciated. And what I love about Selo, and here's a prediction, I think it will be part of his opening remarks, is that he's particularly interested in reviving the real Madiba to the surface, because all of us have our favorite Nelson Mandela. And I think under Selo, we're beginning to see a reimagining in the public space of who Nelson Mandela truly was, and not the partial Nelson Mandela that a lot of people have. So once again, can we put our hands together and just welcome all of them? Thank you. So there's really just 3 points that I want to make in terms of the backdrop to this debate. The first is that today's Human Rights Day, and there's a massive gap between the normativity of the Constitution and the injustices in our country. And for us, that is one reason why Wadey and I decided to put on this debate. We need to account, and we need to understand why it is that that gap is not getting smaller. And we export jurisprudence that is liberal, that is inclusive, and yet the reality for most South Africans is that they are actually marginalized. So that's the first observation, and I will just leave it there. The second is that while it is important to be solution-oriented, we have far too few public events in South Africa that are backward-looking. We are scared to do historical analysis because we are so anxious to find the solutions for the status quo. And there's nothing wrong with going into the solution space, and I've given my speakers carte blanche to say whatever they want. But we deliberately wanted to frame a discussion that looks back over our shoulders rather than into the future, because we've got to ask ourselves, where do we come from? So that's the second point I want to make, just by way of framing. And then the last one, which really segues nicely from the second one, I think, is that in the limited historical discussions that do take place, and there's not enough of them, we tend to have an understanding of the proximate causes of our injustices. 2 words, Jacob Zuma. Alternatively, when we go deep into history, it is colonialism and apartheid. And Wadey and I wanted to ask the question, what happened in between? We know that colonialism was a bastard. We know that Jacob Zuma was something. But what about that moment in 1994, and what about the Kodesa years leading up to it? And I think now, with the passage of time, we are in a position to ask critical questions, not just about Mandela the individual, but also, and this was deliberate in the wording of today's question, Mandela's government, and whether or not there's accounting to be done there, and to ask all of those questions. So with that said, I'm going to ask Sizwe to open us. I'm sorry we're not slightly elevated. I'm standing so that all of you can see me, but I'm going to ask my panelists to do whatever's comfortable for them. If they want to sit, that's fine. And just listen very clearly to what they have to say. Can we please give Sizwe a round of applause? He's going to make the first intervention.
Thanks very much. It's really wonderful to see such a packed house for such an important debate. Eusebius, thanks very much for the introduction. Aunt Karima, Sislebuchang, and Tatiselo. It's really wonderful to share this platform with you. Thank you very much. I begin my book, Democracy and Delusion, with the following statement. 2 decades of rainbow mythology have soothed South Africa into a state of chronic complacency. We were sold a lie that the vote would resolve our country's fundamental problems if we only had the patience to wait. To move forward, we must have the courage to scrutinize the comfort of our complacency. And what I was trying to do with that statement was shake us out of the complacency that I think has defined the last 24 years, and to really ask us, implore us all, to take a very hard look at our society. The other thing I was trying to do with that statement was to try to wipe away some of the narratives that prevent us from taking a very hard look at our society. Those narratives are the miracle narrative. The most dangerous narrative you can found a nation on is a miracle. The hope narrative, the idea that you should postpone accountability because hope is just around the corner. And the progress narrative, that there is this linear progress that is gripping our country, and even though we can't actually see it, somewhere in some abstract place, progress is marching on. And I wanted to challenge those views. But I didn't want to do so in a naive way. And this is really what I would like to bring home in this discussion and debate today. Because on the one hand, it is crucial that we do complicate the very juvenile narratives that surround Mandela, democracy, and the Mandela government. There's no doubt that we deified Mandela unduly and that we're now paying the price for that deification. But we do also need to be honest with ourselves that the opposite narrative, a narrative of total vilification, a narrative which says we didn't win anything, is perhaps popular, but not quite honest. And so the real thing I think we need to be doing in this moment is passing apart where we have won and realizing where there have been victories, and then also passing apart the places where we actually have failed. And that's what I'd like to do with the remainder of my time. So what I'll do is I'll focus first on what I think the failures have been, where we really do need to challenge the Mandela government's role in the paradoxes and the problems that we see in our contemporary society. What I'll do after that is I'll show that the way that history is being marshaled in service of present political agendas. Because as much as this is a debate about the past, it's also about the way that in the present we use the past. And I think that's something that we need to bring out. And then finally, what I'll do is reflect on some of the areas where I do think there were legitimate victories and defend those victories against potential critique. So let's begin with the failures of the Mandela government. And even saying those words seems like a heretical act sometimes. But I think we do need to be quite open and honest about where the Mandela government failed. And for me, the glaring area is around the question of reconciliation, or conciliation, because I don't remember a time we were ever reconciled. And I do think that we allowed a politics of spectacle to overturn a very real cry for actual tangible justice. And I think we went too far, or I wasn't there, Mandela's government went too far in replacing ambitious redistributive change along gender and racial lines and many other lines, and replaced that with a politics of spectacle which symbolized that change, but which was ultimately hollow. And the reason I say that is because I think there's a very firm sense in our society today, it's a sense which I feel, that the beneficiaries of apartheid in general and the people who carried apartheid out never really lost anything significant. And here's the problem. I understand why that calculation was made, to preserve stability and to preserve peace. And we only need to look at war zones to realize the importance of those ideas. But I think the calculation was fundamentally flawed because it did another very surreptitious thing. It imbued our society from its foundation with a sense of impunity. And that impunity, I believe, has spread to the post-democratic era. And so we do have President Zuma turning around and saying, hold on, de Klerk is walking free. Why should I be tried? And I never say this, but he's right. Now, he's also wrong. The answer is to try both of them. It doesn't mean we must exonerate Zuma. But what it does do is it speaks to this foundation of impunity, not just for the functionaries of apartheid, but for white South Africans in general. And that sense of impunity, I think, strikes at the heart of a great deal of anger that is bubbling at the surface of our society. So I would say the attitudes towards reconciliation, the failure to take forward the outcomes of the TRC, particularly around reparation and economic redistribution, and the whole amnesty question and the way it was framed, gave us a short-term reprieve, but has created very long-term systemic problems that lie right at the root of our society that could go off at any time. I would also say that in terms of economic policy, I think there was a great deal of timidity, particularly in the face of international institutions and market-based economic rhetoric. When we look at the way that industry was really tackled, the BEE policy that flowed from the early part of the ANC's tenure in government was its most crass form. And by the way, our current president was a beneficiary of that crass form of BEE. I know he only appeared when he started walking on the Sea Point Promenade, but there is kind of a history to this. And so I do think that it's important that we scrutinize the fact that we didn't get very serious about economic redistribution, and we can go into a bit more detail. What I would say now is that the bargain that was made to postpone justice was only made, and Mandela himself made this very clear, it was only made if that justice actually happened in fairly short order after the period of peace was bought. Now, the problem we have is you can't buy a period of stability and then not do anything with the stability you bought, and that's the problem. Our current failures are exacerbating the way that the past looks like treachery because we are failing to take advantage of the period of time we were given. And so people, in the ANC now would turn around and say, no, Mandela's government sold us out. No, you sold us out by not following through on the short period of reprieve that we were given to actually make fundamental change. So I do think it's also important that we focus on the way the past is marshaled to protect the present. So there were important victories, and I'm going to wrap to end off, so stay tuned. But there are some things that we do need to say in mitigation, as it were. Firstly, the Mandela government was actually involved with drafting the Constitution and seeing the Constitution to fruition. That was a big, important victory, I would suggest. Despite some problems which we may have with the Constitution, I think that was a good thing that happened. Mandela's focus on political accountability for senior politicians was also a very good thing, and his decision to step down, I think, does need to be commended. So I think there are quite important victories that did happen at that time that we shouldn't lose sight of. However, those victories do seem to be being surmounted by just the sheer frustration that we find ourselves in. And I'd like to encapsulate that with the verse that I've written to end off, and then it'll be really interesting to hear from you and the fellow panelists. Our juxtaposition, it seems, is we're between Biko's dream and Hollywood screens. And though political freedom was a lifeline, the distance between Alex and Santon is still a lifetime. The crime rate raises my heart rate. This inequality's enough to make your heart break. The disillusionment, the poverty and heartache got me thinking whether we defeated apartheid. Thank you.
Thank you, Sizwe. I can't guarantee that Karima will also rap. But I know that she will critically engage Sizwe. Can we also welcome Karima, please?
So just let me put it out there from the get-go. I can't rap, I don't rap, so I can only speak. Sorry.
Ons hoor jou.
You see, that's experience. It's a very hard taskmaster. You only know that something doesn't work when you're in it. And so it's a really good place for me to start. So I like the critique about the Mandela years, but I think when we put on our lenses to critique that period, we need to remind ourselves of what the world was like when Mandela was facing those choices. And I don't think often enough there is an appreciation of the objective reality as it obtained then. And I think that, for me, is probably the biggest flaw in some of the critique. I think the critique is necessary. I don't think Mandela is a saint. I don't think he's above criticism. And I don't think that he's above mistakes. In fact, he was a remarkable man, but he was a deeply flawed man. He was a leader who made many, many mistakes. But his legacy, his rule, and everything to do with him is a contested space, as it should be. I don't actually mind the contestation. I think there should be more of it. So let's look at the world through which Mandela looked at how to be part of a process that gets us from apartheid colonialism to the democratic breakthrough in 1994. I was looking for something that would kind of root that argument for me, and I came across a quote of Fidel Castro where he spoke about the importance of peace, because peace is often referred to willy-nilly. Particularly when we talk about peace and justice. So Fidel Castro says, without peace, we are sure of that, development is not possible. Just as peace would not be possible without development. And I think not enough relevance and importance is attached to that. So when I came across this quote, I made an entry. I said, beautiful and apt quote. So often when we discuss political settlements, especially negotiations, we underestimate and underplay the centrality of the need for peace. Of course, as revolutionaries and progressives, we always add the caveat and the need for a just peace. to ensure that peace doesn't trump justice. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that it's not about the one trumping the other. It's about the dialectic between peace and justice. The one, in many ways, is a necessity for the other to even stand a chance, a remote chance of success. And of course, that's what Sizwe was also talking about, the issue around what we did with that peace dividend and whether we used it to advance the cause of justice. And when we critique that, is that a function of Mandela having sold out, or a government that got sidetracked by the sins of incumbency and the trappings of power, rather than use the enabling mechanisms that are actually all around us in so many of our laws, in so many of our institutions, in so many of the political implements that we have given ourselves. So I think when we evaluate Mandela's legacy, or whether or not his government set us up to fail, we must distinguish between what the democratic breakthrough put in sight and as an offering, and whether we took the opportunity, and more importantly, why it is that we didn't take those opportunities. And of course, when we look at why we didn't take those opportunities, I think it had very little to do with the fact that those policies were unjust or incorrect or not comprehensive enough. If one, for example, catapult that to the current debate about whether the Constitution in its current form allows us to enable land justice and correcting the historical injustices of the past. And the truth is that we are being led by politicians again, and we're being led astray. The Constitution actually has very ample provisions to enable this government to introduce and to enact very radical policies that will actually give the majority a fighting chance. The fact that it is prepared to engage in the politics of ruse around the supposed amendment so that it can now do what it chose not to do for 23 years is just that. It's politics. It's not struggle, and it's not about ordinary people. And we should be really clear and careful to not be misled again by the politics of spectacle, whether it is Jacob Zuma's spectacle or Julius Malema's. If there's one thing that we've learned in this 23 or 24 years, is that we need to take everything that every politician says, including Mandela, with a pinch of salt. We need to not outsource our responsibilities again to big men and women of politics. The responsibility actually starts with us. So in my view, Nelson Mandela left us with a beginning, not an end. 1994 was a beginning. What we choose to do with that beginning is up to us. We can cede it to elites, or we can take charge of it ourselves. But what we can't do is blame Nelson Mandela for the choices that we are making. Thanks.
Thank you, Karima. And our next speaker up is Lebogang.
Thank you. Dumelang. Exe. Peter. Hola. How's it? Yeah, good. So, greetings to all of the speakers, the panelists, points of divergence, points of conflation and agreement, but always deep and mutual respect. And love to all of us here on the commemoration of Sharpeville massacre. So I've got a couple of points of departure and divergence with which I want to frame this particular piece, this particular offering on this day. And I want to ask a question. The question, I'm going to walk around. I'm so sorry. I have to. When I get, yeah, in heels, huh? So I want to ask a question. What is a sellout? And what is its genesis? What is its intention and what is its way of being? Who is responsible for it? And who is responsible for selling a nightmare dressed up as a rainbow dream? And for subverting days like this one? Days like the commemoration of Sharpeville and Langa massacres. So I've been doing a lot of reading and writing on history. So I think that the previous speakers have given us an excellent platform around the recent politics and the recent economics and concessions and structure, architecture of the 1994 transition, which saves me about 4 minutes. I want to contend that memory itself is a human right. What we are enabled to recollect and the way that we're enabled to recollect, including who sold, what was sold, and what was at stake. I think it's also very important for us to remember that memory is an expression of universal humanity, all of our humanity. It's very important for us to understand that these cannot be isolated to an individual, to a chap or a chapette. It cannot be isolated to one event. This has to be situated between structural, systemic, political, economic questions of power, the ceding of power, the transfer of power, the refusal to cede and transfer power. Some of the tensions that previous speakers have spoken about. And we are constantly wrestling with these tensions, the tensions between the past and the present, the tensions between what is and what is not, the tensions between what should be and what actually is. Now, on this day, I'd be doing a great disservice if I didn't go into the dusty history archives for a minute or two. So I want to suggest that one of the first punk out moments or sellout moments or concession moments would probably be 1955, the Kliptown Charter. And this is really the moment where there's a point of departure between the Africanist bloc, and remember that everybody was in the ANC Youth League then. So Mr. Mandela, Mr. Sobukwe, Mr. Tambo, Mr. Mda, etc., etc. These people were all compatriots and comrades together. But basically, this point of departure is really to do with what had birthed the Defiance Campaign. The Defiance Campaign was a moment for us to think about how we are going to, as African people, claim back our personhood. Who here is holding their ID book? It's not a trick question. Who's holding their ID book? We hold it for all kinds of reasons. Okay. So remember that the ID book is a successor of what? So the passbook was a symbol of black person's personhood. You could not be a human being and present in white spaces without this symbol of a personhood. And we hear stories about people whose lives were put at risk, who died in flames of their homes, racing to excavate this little symbol of their personhood as black people, as African people in this country. So we have to understand that the idea of defying a white capitalist construct of black person's personhood as being to the service, the chattel of white families, white farms, going down white-owned mines, even though the minerals do belong to black people, but going down white-owned mines must not be negated. And that the demands that were made at Sharpeville, when Sobukwe called for people to put down their passbooks, he was calling for them to claim back their black personhood. Okay. So this was actually a powerful assault on white capital. It was a powerful assault on the right to be, the right to exist, and the right to frame ourselves other than in a white person's imagination, and to remove the white gaze from black person's personhood in this country. And Frans Fanon has called this the 17 days that shook South Africa and, in fact, shook the world, and are still shaking the world in different ways. Okay? So I think that 1955 represents the first kind of punk out moment. The second would probably be 1961, where certain factions of what was formerly, Bra Ezra, okay? Friendly face. Where, this was a collective call. History should record that this was a collective call. The call to put down passbooks was made to all political parties, to all social formations, and to all social movements. And one party decided not to participate in this. And a week later, Ntate Albert Luthuli then subsequently went to present himself just after history had passed him by. Just after after the days had shaken the country and shaken the world. Just after people in Sharpeville and Langa had already been martyred to also claim back black personhood. Late, very late. My third point of departure is how and where we house history and memory. And I was very impressed when I sent my remarks of what I was going to say to Ms. Wade here, Davy. And I was like, this is my critique. I'm very uncomfortable in this space. I'm uncomfortable about the way this part, places like the Freedom Park, places like Apartheid Museum, the way that they narrowly curate a particular version of history, her story, our story. I came here, the last time I was here intentionally was like 12, 14 years ago for some post-grad studies. Sobukwe was spelled wrong. And I'm gonna walk around this evening and make sure that Sobukwe has since been spelled correctly. This is very important. It's very important, okay? And I think that also understanding that there's a very contested history to the origins of this particular museum. Most of us know Mike Steinberg, and he has said a few things about how he feels that the Klok brothers usurped this space, this idea of how memory should be curated from him and from the black population, from the African imagination. So I think these are very important things for us to locate ourselves within. Thirdly, I think that it's also important that the TRC, which has been eloquently alluded to already, as part of the curation of a dishonest, problematic, and parochial approach to the past, comes into the frame. And it owes its being to the legacy of concessions made during the negotiated settlement and has institutionalized mistruths and anti-history, curated by Ndate Dudu, Ndate Mandela, et al. And I believe that a platform to create, to speak truth and create honest dialogue about the causes and consequences of colonial apartheid atrocities instead absolved white capital and white atrocities, institutionalized race oppression and colonialism. And then it forced us as Africans into this microwaved forgiveness and this collective amnesia. And yet history doesn't forget. That is why when people ask, why are you so angry as black people? Why are South Africans so angry? You need to ask. So I think that official history has decided that nobody is culpable. So that's the next sellout, punk out point. That official history decides that nobody in particular is culpable. It decides that, the freedom fighters and their oppressors are on par. What nonsense is that? Nobody could go to Nuremberg and say that the Nazis and the Jews and all the other people who were in concentration camps were on par. And it should be remembered that elements such as Chase Manhattan and others helped to rescue the apartheid regime back in 1961. Bank of America, First National Bank of Illinois, to the tune of 100 million pounds at the time, and which is worth, billions right now. This is very significant because if that had not happened, South Africa would have become a democratic, liberated space in 1961 or 1962, the latest. Journalists such as Alistair Sparks and so many others have written and said that all of the conditions of Sharpeville and Langa mass uprisings were conducive to the immediate transfer of power from African hands, from black hands, from white hands to African hands, immediately. Instead, we had to wait, hope deferred, for 34 bloody years. For something esinyona, not quite even there. Okay? So I want to ask, what are the critical elements in closing of this purported revolution in deliberate snide commas? And what benchmarks are set to evaluate it? If this constitutional democracy and the electoral system that underpins it represent the reversal of the previous political power relations, then we're in trouble because they don't represent corrective justice. And they don't represent new economic power relations. They have absorbed the existing power relations. They have continued to privilege. And I'm of the opinion that this constitutional democracy is a deep obfuscation and obscuring and intentional diversion from liberation politics. It actually depoliticizes freedom. We have just emerged from 10 years of a constitutionally enabled dictatorship. Call it what you want, but that is my contention. However, it is not entirely fair to lay a portion of blame to one person. Even though Ntate Mandela called the free market economy, which I don't have the time to go into, a magic elixir, and argued that it presented the only hope, and wrongly argued, I argue, the only hope for creating a prosperous and just new South Africa. I still don't think that we can lay a portion entirely to him, even though in many respects, he and others like him were mascots for this project. I would argue that the moderate allies of whom, the ANC historically, and people like Mr. Mandela, Mr. Sisulu, may have represented, were then supported by a few key elements. And I argue that systematic, structural, political, economic, and imperial power relations are usually about the elongation of their power, the elongation of their influence, the elongation of their presence, tangible or intangible. Number one, this is through the production and distribution of the economy. Number two, through the control over and production of media and ideas. Number three, the production of ideas in academic spaces. Fees must fall and colonial curricula must fall. And number four, the control of social and political ideas of race-based entitlements using fancy instruments such as the law and such as the Constitution. So empowering black people, oh yes, the elongation of the National Party of Chase Manhattan, of people like Cecil B. Rhodes, of Lon Min, and so many others, among others, are still daintily secured in today's South Africa. Which is why, when there was a massacre called Lon Min, it reminded us of who? It reminded us again of Sharpeville. 30 years later, and still we're being 40, 50, almost 50 years later, and still we're being mowed down by people who look like us, which shows that white interests can indeed metamorphose and wear a black face. And finally, I want to argue again, who was bought and who was sold off? Memory and the silencing of the less comfortable versions of ourselves, of our recollections, I think is a continued instrument of oppression. Different forms of oppression, discursive oppression, ideological oppression, race oppression. And this includes the ignominy of negotiation with and accommodation of minority whites, usually white minority interests. Proclamation must be a part of liberation. It has to be. We must speak it out. And silence is the part of the sellout. Silence and erasure are part of the real sellout. Misappropriation of voice is part of the real sellout. So I go back to my initial question. What is a sellout? And what is its genesis? Its intention and its way of being. Who was responsible for selling a nightmare dressed as a rainbow dream and for subverting days like this? I want to end with two quotes. I'm not going to say who they're from. You can think about it or ask me about them during the Q&A. The one is, the oppressors do not favor promoting the community as a whole, but rather selected leaders. The other is, we are witnesses today of a cold and calculated brutality, the desperate attempts of a dying generation to stay in power. Maibuye.
Thank you to Lebogang. Anyone who moderates when there are cameras around will tell you that a speaker is really on fire when the camera person starts clapping and going. Last but not least, can we put our hands together for Cello, please?
Thank you very much and good afternoon. You know, one of the things that I have to do up front, Eusebius, is a couple of disclaimers. The first one is that rapping has never been my strongest, not even singing. The Soweto Gospel Choir rejected me 5 times, so that should tell you something. I didn't even get to audition. Then the second one is that I'm not here to defend Madiba. Madiba's legacy stands on its own. It does its own thing and it will keep standing on its own. But if Madiba himself understood that he was never a saint, who am I to crown him sainthood? So he gave this, he said, one of the biggest mistakes he made while in prison was to give the false impression that he was a saint. And he says, I never was one, not even on the basis of an earthly definition of a saint, as a sinner who keeps on trying. So based on that, I think we need to be looking at the legacy with a view of us ensuring that legacies live longest, or understanding that legacies live longest when reimagined. So once a legacy it stagnates and it's understood to be, it dies. The second thing is that legacies, for a legacy to continue to live, it must remain relevant to today's realities. So are we surprised at the Nelson Mandela Foundation that there have been this uproar of Madiba as being a sellout? We're not. In fact, if anything, it should happen. Because you'll remember that today, very few people will ever claim that they supported Zuma. Very few. You'll find it hard. And then you'll find many who claim that we were all for Mbeki to continue and finish his term. So it's a measure of history and time. So time always brings these things back to be new realities. And the sellout, the tag of sellout, similarly, is that of time, as I said. But then, what kind of responses have we heard before? And I'm going to give you three kind of responses we've heard. So there was one response that says, well, Madiba tried his best. You know, in terms of poverty alleviation, he introduced social grants, there was political stability, and a good story to tell. That's good story to tell, the response. The second one is then the one that says, well, he didn't have enough time. 5 years is not enough. You know, so he had to do a lot in the 5 years. Bring a nation together and do all these things. But in fact, if we even talking about time, the Truth Commission's recommendations, and I'm looking at some of the colleagues I worked with at the Truth Commission back then, the recommendations of the Truth Commission as they relate to land reform, as they relate to prosecutions and increased wealth taxes were never acted upon. Whose responsibility is that? Remembering when the Truth Commission's report was handed in. And it's important. So let's not be ahistorical. When we pass judgments like these, we need to then be putting them against what actually happened during that time. Then another one is, actually Madiba maybe had wrong advisors on the economy. You've heard this one before. So he had many wrong advisors maybe. These chief architects who were behind him and next to him were trying to just push white monopoly capital. Madiba had exigency too. And I think he made some calls. And those calls, you can't then exonerate him from. But I thought, as we deal with this legacy, I called Eusebius and I said, you know, when I first saw the invite, I found it difficult to just say yes, because you are bound to get it wrong either way. Did Madiba's government set us up for failure? You say yes, you're wrong. You say no, you're wrong. So I was saying these binaries make it so difficult for me because it's complex. And that complexity is acknowledged by Madiba himself in a book that we just published, where he started writing what would have been a sequel to Long Walk to Freedom, and he titled the first chapter, The Challenge of Governing. And that challenge is acknowledging that it was not easy for him to then do what he then had to do. One of the things that we keep forgetting is the fact that as part of the government of Nelson Mandela was the government of national unity. We disavow collective decisions whenever it suits us. I hope so in other words, whenever it suits us, we say, no, that's Madiba. You know, that's a Madiba government thing. But actually, there was a government of national unity that included IFP, that included the PAC, the PAC didn't participate. Yeah. So they didn't even make it into the thing. So I think it's those complexities of having to understand that the government of national unity, let's not disavow history, because it's that disavowal that then makes it, we wash it whenever it suits us. I also want to then, I want to offer this a bit of context by using the analogy of medicine to make my point. So in 1994, we had a critical and most probably dying patient. And we forget that the apartheid government was a criminal state. You just have to read Van Vieren to understand that it was a criminal state that then ensured that everything that happened in South Africa was criminal. And there, Madiba and his team had to stabilize the patient first so that the patient doesn't die. And it's that measure of what did he do then, the after effects is what we're dealing with today. The medicine that was taken, now we're dealing with the after effects. What do you then do with the after effects? When the doctor says, no, you're gonna most probably get a headache, you must drink water. It means we must change. But that's what I find difficult to understand, why with this context that we have, as this patient who was dying, who had to be stabilized, once stable, the next administrations, what do they do to change? And I find it interesting that every time we harp on about what Madiba got wrong, and then I would say, since then, from 1994, what have we changed? What have we changed? Honestly, what have we actually changed? It means that whatever he did back then must have been so good that we still think that medicine is too good to let go. Otherwise, how do you explain not changing? Not changing anything, instead complaining about 94, but not changing anything. That's why the land question, and I like what you, don't know if it's Karima or yourself, the question about land, that we should never be fooled. The constitutional provision was there, has always been there. So we can't now claim, actually it's a new thing. Land is a big issue today, and we don't look at all the facets of land and as it affects our people. In fact, one of my colleagues who might be here is looking at how land affects crashes. A crash. You know how crashes don't get, township crashes especially, don't get any support from government because they don't have title deeds. But instead, we're thinking of land, we don't look at all the facets. How does it affect the child? A township child who is at the age of 0 to 6 is not in any kind of formal ECD schooling that stimulates them. Instead, they're at home or in a detention center that just holds them for their parents to find them safe, and then they just get handed back. So how do we get that right? I want to then paint a final point before I get off. It's how Madiba found himself in a situation where the military was not on his side, SAPS was not on his side, and within 2 years, he managed to then stabilize the two and get them, these forces. Violence was real. So we should never deny that. And the Mick Madiba is the same Mick Madiba who told Freddie Hartenbeck and General Viljoen, you might as well get out of my house and go and cause war. Our people will fight you with their stones. They will fight you to the bitter end, and you won't finish us. We are too many. But that war can continue. But you have a choice. You start that war, you must know to rebuild South Africa will be like Mozambique and Angola. And these are choices, real choices that had to be made. I want to end off about how popular Madiba was. So when we did asked my colleagues to just look at some of the stats of how popular Madiba was at the time. And there the stats suggest that with the Mail and Guardian cabinet report, for example, Madiba got a 9, a 5, a 8, and 2 7s. A 9.5 at the end. By 1997, he had a B rating. In terms of popularity by country now, in terms of how South Africans judged him, he moved from 75%, and by the time he gave up power, it was 85% of popularity. Are these figures just from Madiba Foria? Maybe they are just unreal. but there are statistics that we rely on as people whenever we judge people's popularity. We might have been sold a lie. Progress might maybe not be in our favor. We might have postponed accountability with a promise of hope. But may we never forget that everything that was done in our country was to ensure that we have a stable country that can reimagine itself for those who are still to be born. That may they be born not under 1993 conditions, but be born in whatever century that they can be born. So for Madiba's centenary, I'm asking you, I'm pleading with you to do one thing. As you reimagine this legacy, let's be truthful with history. But as we become truthful, we must not be then rehashing the past for its sake. Let's not reminisce about the past for its sake. Let's try reimagine the future that we want for those who are still to be born.
Thank you to Cello, and thank you to all of my panelists. Okay, I've got a very difficult task here. I'm going to ask you to please not own the mic. Also, don't treat my panelists as gurus. If you have a pointed question for them, that's fine. I've already told them before the event started that it's not compulsory for them to answer every single question. So you may want to make a comment of your own, an intervention of your own, raise a point that hasn't been raised, or if you want to ask a question, you can do so as well. And we'll have a couple of bites of the cherry before we allow for closing comment. And then after that, we'll just have to mill about and have more intimate conversation as well. I think we've got 2 roving mics. Who's got the mics? There's a mic on that side and on this side. I will also use mine as a roving mic. So if you put up your hand, then we'll get a mic to you as quickly as possible. The gentleman in the red cap, or the lady, someone over there has a red cap. And in fact, I'm going to ask the people who have the mics to just to find someone who has put up their hand. And I'll try and look out for anyone who's been holding their hand for a long time. And then if you have the mic, please do speak.
Dumelang. To Ntate Khatang, this question I think is directed to you about Madiba. One thing that I wanted to know in terms of education, why did Madiba and the government of that time close the nursing colleges, teachers' colleges and technical colleges, not closing them and moving them to the universities, where now then if you don't have money to go to VETS or to UJ, to whatever, then you can't afford it. What was the motive behind?
Okay. Bandile.
Hi, thank you to the panelists for their contributions. My comment / question is around what I see today that's similar to the dilemma that Madiba faced. So if you think of Madiba's legacy, you'll find that it was a situation where there are many competing interests and radically polarized interests in society that had to be reconciled, this whole stabilizing thing. And I think it's only useful to talk about history if you explicitly relate to how it's relevant today and what lessons it could teach you today. So we are currently in a situation where we have a lot of polarization. And so I think, and then one of the critiques of Mandela's sort of history was this overemphasis on sentiment and, collective decisions, and let's all get around the table and have to agree to things before we move on. And I think that's a similar problem that the current president faces now. I mean, in his plan, in the State of the Nation, he talks about all these summits we'll have on jobs and having discussions and, conferences on things instead of taking decisive action. So that's the reflection. And the question is, so if you were a tactical advisor to Cyril Ramaphosa, given that he's in a similar point in history where it's a lot of polarization and the one route he could take is just having summits and conferences and try to get consensus on things, the stabilizing thing, what would you do to advise him practically, say on the land or in anything else, to actually just bloody do stuff and get stuff done? Instead of chatting and kumbayaing. That's Eusebius's favorite word, having a kumbaya session. Thank you.
My other favorite word is Maluti Ki Gupta. You can get rid of him. Okay, any questions here in the middle?
Yes, I've got the mic.
I think one of the speakers talked about Mandela bringing peace. And for me, as a woman in South Africa, I feel that I've been sold out because I am living in a very violent, not safe society. And I think Cyril is doing the same thing. He takes a lot of money, bring back in Nhlanhlanene. I wonder how much did they bring to Nhlanhlanene as a package so that he could leave his 3 senior positions, because he claimed in the 702 last month that he is overemployed. And number 2, he also, fired Moyana now, but still keeping Batabile and Shabangu for us as women and children. It's very bad.
Thank you. My question is directed to all the panel members. I just wanted to check if they will agree with my collective takeout from their presentation that the country South Africa from 1994 is built on a flawed foundation of peace, because the team that was led by Ntate Mandela was working on acts such as TRC and sunset clauses, which made them to be so careful that they even forgot to name the child. And it was later nicknamed Rainbow Nation, but it didn't have a name. That's how careful they were. And as a young South African who's trying to participate and continue where they left off, I see it as I participate that when we try to build this country, we are actually cracking the wall. There's a boat called Rand-dollar exchange. Every time when we say free higher education, the wall cracks. When we say land without expropriation, the dollar exchange cracks. So even the calmness of people like Auslebohang will be, they will be calmed with commissions of inquiry instead of solutions.
Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity. I acknowledge that in 1994, when Mandela was making, or the company was making, the concessions for us not to go to war was to save our country. What I've also seen happen in other countries was where war happened, the whites respected the black people. In this country, because we did not go to war, they disrespect us. So I'm wondering, what will it take for us to get respect and for concessions to happen seriously and for change to happen seriously? Following up on this question is, if racism was institutionalized and made law, why can we not make anti-racism or non-racism a law?
Just hold on, just give her back the mic. I just want to ask a question. Should we have gone to war with white people? Should we still?
You know, I was of that generation. I was at the stadium when Chris Hani was assassinated, and I recall the pain we felt and the urge we felt to go to war. And I recall the call for peace. And I understood, because Boipatong was happening. There was so much killing that was going on that we understood that perhaps we should not go to war. But in hindsight, I wonder if we shouldn't have gone to war.
Okay, I'm going to give my panel members a chance to respond. I'm going to take one last question. The most important audience we've had at every single one of our events, Wady, have been our high school learners who are amazing. If you are a high school learner or if you are in school uniform, hopefully not an adult in school uniform, please put up your hand because I will give you a chance to speak. I want to know from young people, very young people, what do you think of Madiba? Do you think he was cool? Do you think we're unfair on him? Do you think that you live in a country that is worse off because I just want to know what you think of Madiba. So the people who have the mics as well, myself included, any young person who puts up their hand in the next round, you will have the first chance to speak.
Thank you. My question is to Tatesello. You said that the patient, your metaphor, the patient was dying and we needed to save the patient. But my question to you is, was the patient itself not so toxic, not socially, politically, economically, the patient could it not have died out so that something better could be transformed from it? And just, you said that we're better than Mozambique, but all these years later, and the 5-year-old child still drowns in a toilet. So what truly makes us better than Mozambique?
Okay, I'm going to ask my panelists to respond. You don't need to respond to every question. You can speak to one that sparked a particular thought so that we can have a second round from the audience. Selo, we're going to start with you. The beauty of analogies is that they are evocative. The danger is that they are subject to counter-analogies.
No, thank you very much. Is it on? Thank you very much. You know, on education, I still remember one of the things that pained me was how we chose to go and find systems in the north and didn't even go look for solutions in the global south. We didn't go to see what Zimbabwe got right. We didn't go and ask Ethiopia, what did you get right? You know, and all these countries, they could have been the poorest, but their education systems were perfect. So on the education front, that's one of the greatest failures of that government, and how it tried to get it right, but it just didn't use even things that were just in the neighborhood. So in terms of the nursing colleges, and again, that's another one that I think this is now just me thinking that how people we got into government, and as soon as we got in, the first thing to do was to undo everything that had to do with TBVC states. That's the first thing that had to go. And in the process, we destroyed even the things that were actually the best. And it's only now that we're looking at, again, revisiting the nursing colleges and the teachers' colleges. Because those could have been something that today we would have looked back and said, it's a gift we should have improved instead of just completely destroying. Now there's a question about violence in society in terms of peacemaking, how Madiba got the peace, and I think we're looking at the issue of violence in our society as something that, and we can't deny it, is that we are wounded people. And our woundedness is such that you can still have, and I always relate the story of how at the age of 14, I had a guy who just didn't care that I was a child, who hit me by the butt of the rifle, knocked me out. I got up, and when I realized they kicked me and said, get out of it. There was a riot at school. He didn't care that I was a 14-year-old child. You know? So those wounds we live with. And they then manifest themselves in ways where people then continue to, and what hurts most is how not only Michael Komape, who died, but the little girl now dying, her name is
Mketwa.
Mketwa. Yeah. And for me, we vowed when Michael died, that was the last death in pit toilets. Our woundedness makes us forget even the undertakings we make yesterday. So on the issue of violence, that's the best I think we should be looking at. The patient dying. In fact, looking at the statistics, and I'm going to give you the example of what happened at the foundation. So we hosted a dialogue using the movie The Bloody Miracle. I don't know if you've watched it. If you haven't, please do. Because it shows the last few days of the government, the apartheid government falling, and how many black people died. And how it's called The Bloody Miracle. And in there, we then had a moment where two people were in the audience. So the one says, my father was a good man. He was a God-fearing man. It's the daughter of the guy who was killed in Bufutazwana, the Avia beer guy. And on the other hand, you have the soldier who killed him saying he was an animal. He killed my people randomly, and I was called, and when I came out, I just shot him dead. And they met for the first time at the foundation. And out of that, you must create a platform for something new to be born. How it dies is the question. And in our case, I think we had Madiba making the choice that we don't want to go through what other countries up north have gone through, where you destroy every building. Syria is going through that now. You destroy every building, you create refugees who run to other countries, and then rebuild. You then have people having to come back home. So I think the dying part, maybe we didn't kill the seed enough for it to regenerate the new thing.
Thank you, Sela. I'm going to jump around a little bit. Sizwe?
Sure, thanks. I think what's fascinating for me in this debate so far is that nobody has contested that we've failed. The question is now, whose fault is it? And in many ways, that goes back to the original question, because here we are failing. I'd like to reflect firstly on the advice that I would give to President Ramaphosa, apart from resign. I would say it's really funny how we're now experiencing the new rainbowism. And I think this is the most dangerous feature of our current society right now. We're replacing old rainbowism not with a very direct conversation, but with a new politics of vacuous hope and a politics of Ramaphosa-enthused spectacle. And I would say, Mr. President, there's only so many times you can walk before people want more than walking. And it's really time to stop walking and start talking. I would also say it would be really nice if your cabinet wasn't filled with 65-year-old, mainly men. Men! And I joked, and it kind of went viral, that the new dawn looks like an old-aged home. So we'd like to see that. But secondly, on the question of Marikana, which I think links to many of the debates we've had here and echoes Sharpeville and the reason we have this day, is it's quite stupendous to me that we've swept this question under the carpet. And I really want a reckoning over this question because it feeds back to the impunity that I said earlier has now fed into our society. Because we gave this blanket amnesty and blanket immunity, it seems to be moving to President Zuma and President Ramaphosa now. So we're not allowed to have this conversation when there are very serious questions to answer. So I would say that what I would like to end on is the question from the front here from Umama, and I think your point is absolutely crucial, that the democratic promise has reached women and especially black women last. There's no doubt about that. Not only did they have to deal with the nonsense from racist white men, but they also have to deal with the nonsense from problematic black men. And all of us are that. And so I stand absolutely affirming your point as well as realizing my implication in that problem. And I think, again, when we ask ourselves how far we went towards radical gender transformation, that's another area where I think we failed from the beginning and are continuing to fail now.
Thank you, Sizwe. Karima?
Okay, so for people who wonder about whether we should have gone to war, we were at war. We just didn't win outrightly. And that's why we had to settle. And when you settle, you compromise. And so it's important to understand the world for what it is and not as how we imagine or like it to be. Not that imagination doesn't have its place. But I think it's really important to understand that from the period, certainly from 76 onward, to probably even early 1994, what you had was effectively elements of dual power. The South African apartheid state couldn't subdue us, and we couldn't defeat them. So what is it that people who lead constituencies do in instances like that? And that is what we need to look at, to examine the extent to which what we had negotiated enables or disables us to reimagine the country that we want to live in and that we want our children to live in. And I think for me that is a really important point. The other thing that we mustn't forget is that the apartheid state couldn't exist for as long as it did without the active complicity of large sections of the oppressed. And we don't take enough time to look at what that actually means for the kind of democratic project that we are busy with now. So for example, when we talk about sunset clauses, we only speak about the white generals, but we don't talk about the supernumeraries in former Bophuthatswana, in Ciskei, in Transkei, in Ga-Rankuwa. Those same supernumeraries are the ones that are involved in fake teachers and ghost teachers and salaries that go wrong. That is why corruption, Gupta style, landed so well, because we had a network like that functioned. If we look, for example, at our police force, every single police commissioner in every province is black. And yet we don't feel safe with our own police. What does that mean about our understanding of transformation? What does it mean about our understanding of what it is to be progressive? What it is about our understanding of what is revolutionary? There's not enough introspection on what it is that we were part of and what it is that we're mimicking. There is a sense that we want a license to loot like whites did, a license to steal like they did, to get educated like they did. For me, there's no moral equivalence. I don't want that kind of orientation. I don't give a damn about how whites under apartheid did things. I think we hold ourselves to a higher morality, a different morality. And we haven't even begun to talk about what that means. When we want to give Zuma a get-out-of-jail card, when we want to give a corrupt business person a get-out-of-jail card, we talk about whites policing black wealth. We don't talk about what it actually means to steal from a democratic state that over 60% of those who are eligible to vote, who decided to vote, elected into power, and what that says about ourselves. And I think it is easy to blame whites. And yes, we need to look at white supremacy. We need to look at whiteness. But that's only part of the issue. We also need to look at ourselves. We need to ask really tough questions about what a transformed and a progressive South Africa needs to look like and what our roles in it is going to be. We also need to talk about the elites. We need to talk about the way in which our liberation movements, not just the African National Congress, all of them were compromised, took bad decisions. Why it is that when we had our first democratic election, that the PAC couldn't muster that 5%. I'm old enough to tell you that I was in the old Shell House when the election results were announced. I stood under Madiba. He was shocked. He expected to have the PAC in his first government of national unity. Why is it that it couldn't land with the South African public? Because after all, we also don't impose ourselves on people. People must decide who they want as their leaders. And people have decided for over 23 years. What exactly does that choice actually mean? And how do we take responsibility for the choices that we make as voters? They're not easy questions. It's easy to be angry, and anger is righteous, but it doesn't solve anything. We've still got the country to govern. We've still got a future to build. And I think we need to find ways in which we actually need to do that. And so I'm actually not fazed about those 4 summits. I think we must have more. We must talk more. But after the talking, we must also do. But don't say stop talking. That can never be a bad thing. It's when you only talk that there's a problem.
Thank you, Karima. Lebogang.
Okay. So I think I want to sort of respond to all of the questions concurrently, and I'm going to answer them in saying this. Firstly, that whiteness has always been at war with black people across this continent. If we think about the Herero genocide in Namibia, if we think about the genocide of the rubber genocides in DRC, in which in 11 years span, the population decreased from 20 million people to 11 million people.
And there's lots of footage of this. So the idea of people being at war is one that not only is implicit to the characterization of black-white relations on this continent. Secondly, I think it's important to understand, however, that this is not a race issue. I think that one of the greatest disservices that we do is to turn this into a civil rights issue. It is not civil rights, man. This is hardcore colonial anti-imperial struggle. And one of the things that is that has been successfully rebranded is South Africa as a different kind of colonialism. Nobody died. My parents and people of my parents' generation, nobody died, went to Robben Island, sat in exile, couldn't bury their parents, couldn't bury their loved ones, couldn't have a relationship with home because they wanted to hold hands on a beach with somebody of a different race, because they wanted to sit on a park bench with somebody of a different race. This is a hardcore liberation anti-imperial struggle. And that's the one thing that's quite essential to take away from this. And this is probably why the patient did not die, because it has to be preserved in order for the same interests, the Chase Manhattans, the international imperial and capital interests, to bolster it, as they have been doing since 1961, as they have been doing since the date of ascension of white supremacy in this country. And as long as we're able to understand that these power plays and these tactics keep on evolving, keep on moving, and they are shifting targets, we will not fail to be unsurprised by their surprising, by their resilience and their ongoing presence in our existence. Lastly, on the question of violence and violent states, I believe that states are inherently violent towards women. They were not designed with women in mind. The national question always subjugated every other question. And we were told as women in the liberation movement, people of my parents' generation, even people of my generation, were told that we'll get to that women's stuff. So we have always been and remain accessories, bridesmaids to the national question. So obviously our states are deformed. They're inherently deformed and inherently disemboweled. Such is life.
Okay, I'm going to have a longer round now, then we're going to wrap it after this. Are there young people who want to ask questions? Now they're running away. You're not young, dude. You've got a beard bigger than mine. Okay, can I ask the folks with the mic to please find me young people? In the meantime, we'll just open at the front. I'm coming to you, yeah, I recognize you.
Should I start with that? Okay. Hi, my name is Firdaus Boboli, and we're actually working on a Mandela project. For the centenary, we producing a documentary talking about Mandela as the Pan-African. And Lebohang, I mean, I take my hat off, I really do, 1,000 times. If we can have more people like you who talk truth to power, I think that, I mean, you've just been amazing. And I hope that you will be speaking more often. I'm sorry, Eusebius. The thing I think, Karima, is the issue of media and how media really dictates what that overall thought is. So even if we lose hope or we want hope or whatever, that we know the media, we're part of the media. We know that we begin to frame things in a particular way. And I'd like us to consider that. So whilst we talk about, is it race, is it class, is it colonialism, what is it, the media that perpetuates in terms of that? And then I think, Salo, really important for us, and this is a really lay kind of thing to say, but I spent a lot of time in Nigeria and in other parts of the continent, and people were really unhappy that once we got our independence, that we went to the West. Every time Madiba had a birthday party, it was Michael Jackson and other people. And Africans were saying to me, do you know what we did? And you didn't think about us. The other very important thing for me as a filmmaker, producer, storyteller, is that I can never get to interview my own people. And let the BBC call them or CNN or anybody else, and they're ready and they are crews and it's happening. And we struggle as storytellers and filmmakers and journalists in this country to talk to our own people. And I hope that this is part of that shift, because whilst we say it's important to talk, we do need to walk that talk. And you are a legend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. So I go to a school where there's like lots of like we're mixed basically. So they
just hold the mic so we can hear you.
I go to a school where there's a lot of like kids of different races, and they encourage diversity and everything. And when we look at like legislation and like everything that is affecting the country post democracy, and all the laws that are in place to like promote black people and empower black people, a lot of my white peers always ask, but is that not reverse racism? And I have an issue with that, and I want to know, like, is it, or are we just rightfully taking back what we were deprived of, like, for years? That's it.
Thank you.
Good day, everyone.
Hello. How's it? My name is Bauer. Good to meet you guys. So basically, one of the biggest discourses in our history for me is the fact that Nelson Mandela told black people to forgive, but none of the white leaders, not Evia, none of them told white people to apologize. And as I'm standing here today, I'm feeling forgiveness, and you guys forgave what has happened in the past, and I thank you for that. But it's still wrong in the sense that from I'm not speaking for every white person, but there needs to be something from our side in a sense of healing. And if you look at the Constitution, the preamble, the first sentence is about healing and amending the wounds of the past. And that's an emotional thing, and that's something that no one spends time on. And I know an apology is not going to feed a hungry child, or an apology is not going to give you title deeds, but I'm passionate about... I'm not sarcastic, sorry, but I'm passionate about conversations, because the TRC did amazing work in the sense that it mostly dealt with people, with victims and with people that did horrible things. But millions more of people were discriminated against, and they could never tell their story and voice their story. So my question for the panel is there still time for white people to come to the conversation and have talks about this? And the other thing is, how does that conversation look? Is it a thing where it's compulsory in school? That's my plan, is to make it compulsory in schools, where 10-year-old white and black kids can sit across each other and just talk about the differences, just get to know each other, because we were programmed not to like each other, and we still reaping the fruits from that seeds that was sown from the flippin' apartheid government that day. So we need to plant new seeds, because 24 years went by like that. So fast forward another 24 years, what's the kind of seeds we're gonna reap, and especially for the youth and the next generation coming forward. So I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, I want to ask you a question back first before you speak. You were asking whether there's still a time, opportunity for whites to come to the conversation. Do you feel uninvited?
No. So I don't feel uninvited, but the thing in society and media is, like, I'm Afrikaans, so probably you've heard of people like AfriForum. So normally the loudest people get the most attention, and their ideas are the ones that's being brought out. But not everyone affiliates with that, just like not everyone affiliates with the stuff Julius Malema says. So I think because we don't have leaders left, if I can call it that, and this is not a me and you guys situation, but there's no Peter Mulder, Freedom Front Plus, I don't know how many people vote for them. AfriForum is very small. So in terms of who to follow, there's no one in terms of that can represent the Afrikaans conversation, because apartheid was a white thing, but Afrikaners, I think, getting the most of the slack, which is fair, because I feel because all the presidents were Afrikaans, and it was mainly Afrikaner thing. The fact that Afrikaans was a compulsory language makes it even more wrong for me. So I'm not feeling uninvited. I just feel like I don't know who can represent the conversation from this side, because my experience is white people don't want to apologize because they feel they're going to lose something, and you can only gain. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Good day, everyone. Looking at Russia as a country, it has changed because of Stalin's cruelness. If it wasn't for Stalin, it wouldn't be where it is today. So Stalin as a leader did it for the country, not for himself. So if we as a country can also vote for a government who's willing to do it for the country and not for themselves, I think we can make a change as a country. Taking it back to the land part, giving land back to the black people won't change anything, because if they're not going to do anything for the country with the land, it doesn't make any change. But looking at it with the white people are making change. it's like if we'd give it back to the black people,
Hold on.
if we'd give it back to the black people, it's like they'd use it because they've lost it. They'd want it back for themselves and not for the country. So I think if we like change our minds from primitive to like intelligent, we can look at this very.
I'm just going to make a statement and let it hang a little bit. Instead of shouting down a young black South African, can I have some quiet, please? We'll rep it in a moment, so just contain the energy for me a little bit. Instead of shouting down or being shocked by what she has to say, why don't you reflect on, as Karima says, what does it say about society that a young black South African can say that? Because her feelings and her words and her opinion, which she's entitled to, do not fall out of the sky. She has a biography in which you are implicated.
Okay. Am I audible? Karima, you have said that Mandela gave us the beginning, not the end. In my view, I beg to differ, because the narrative of the time introduced democracy and that reconciliation as an end in itself. And hence, most of us, I was young at the time, we looked as if we have achieved something. But now when I look back, what exactly, as a black young South African, have I achieved? I don't see anything, because a lot of things are stuck against me as a young black person. So when we say that Mandela gave us the beginning, unfortunately, that was a narrative of the time, framed everything there as an end in itself. Hence, we lived in hope, and that hope had nothing in it. We have been hoping for the past 24 years, and a new hope has just begun, and we don't know how this new hope is going to last, and what exactly is it going to bring to us.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. The question was, what do we think about Nelson Mandela?
Yes.
I'm not going to talk much about Nelson Mandela. I'm going to talk about us as the youth of today. On our way here today, I saw a campaign banner from the ANC, and it showed like a timeline, sort of. And it said, back in the 90s, there was no free education, right? And then it showed 2013 and it showed that 80% of schools were now free. Now, my question, or rather my statement to you is, what exactly is free education? I'm not going to talk about the value of money right now, right? We've gotten to a point in time where our youth, where we don't value our education, right? In the sense that we first to demand that we should not pay to go to school, but how much do we value that education that we are getting? It's of no value whatsoever. It makes no sense to loot and to fight for something that you want when you're not going to take it seriously. I go to school every day, and I know I can see certain people where in 24 years, and I'm not judging, but in 30 years, there'll be the people to stand and say it was the government's fault. When they had the opportunity to study, to learn, and to make something better of their lives, they chose not to. So I'm going to stand here, and it's a plea from me, from my side, to please, it's not the government's job to raise us. It's your job as the people of yesterday. You need to encourage us to do better in all that we do, education-wise, sports-wise, and whatever it is, in anything that we aspire to be. Please be there for us. You don't know how much we're struggling. Thank you.
Stunning. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna take only 3 more interventions, and you can swear at me in the car on your way home, but we do have to wrap. And remember what I said perversely at the beginning? If you thought it wasn't long enough, that's very cool.
Yeah, first. So harking back to CODESA and the subsequent GNU, should we treat the Madiba governing era as a redistributive praxis or just an act of symbolism, so that those very symbols are actioned by future administrations? So using Sizwe as some kind of deportment, what failed? Was it the seed or its germination?
Good question. Thank you.
Sure.
Now I'm being lobbied here to give people the mic. Selo, who are you lobbying for?
No, there's a
Have you
hand
planted
from
people here for
Grenville.
softball questions?
There it is there.
Eh?
Grenville has had his hand for a while.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Even Eusebius's producer, I just somehow can't get through to the show, man. Something between us. All right, Sizwe, great to see you. Last time I saw you were 4 years old. It's Toba's dad. It's amazing, making me feel old.
Back when Mandela was selling us dreams.
Yeah. Okay, so you outed me, so I have to, okay, so I was the very grandiose title, mental health specialist for the TRC. In fact, I was the longest serving member, and I don't wear that as a badge of pride. It's more like shame, or I don't know, qualified shame. So Eusebius, you see, I'm still on your side. He wants analogies, and the best analogy I could think of was, you know when someone dies and you have a trauma and you're feeling very sad and everything, and then your friend, Eusebius, brings up and goes, hey, Tulani, if there's anything I can do, right? What he's really saying is, I'm going to do nothing. But you put down the phone and you're kind of like, wow, Eusebius really cares, man. My friends care about me. It's great. And that's the analogy I used for the Truth Commission. The Truth Commission was, is there anything we can do? If he had an ounce of empathy, he'd say, can I look after your kids? So when in life, and this will happen to you, people will say, is there anything I can do? Don't ever say, is there anything I can do? I know what you mean. We know what you mean. But do something specific, okay? So some comments, but I think the comments have legs. So about the Truth Commission, I think humanity got the better of us. And by saying that, that sounds a ridiculous thing to say. Humanity got the better of us. But Bishop Tutu's humanity got the better of us. I'm not criticizing that man because I love him, but to choose that kind of figurehead for that kind of process stifled ugliness, anger, woundedness, bruisey, horrible, ugly. And remember, the first hearing in East London, he broke down in tears. And then he said, apologized. You know what that just said to the nation? He just said, don't cry. Don't cry. This is not ugly, right? So the final structural point I'd like to make is, the Truth Commission had 3 committees. I don't know whether you remember: human rights violation, reparation, and amnesty. And I understand why they made this mistake, but it's a critical mistake going forward. And that is, the reparation committee was full of social workers and psychologists. Do you know a social worker or a psychologist that has ever got anything done? Right? They're all about process, which is fine. You don't have endpoints when you're a shrink or a social worker, right? But because that was the place where we thought all the pain was, we put all the touchy-feely people there, right? And then in the amnesty committee, we put all the lawyers, right? Should have been the other way around, okay? We missed so many opportunities for on-the-spot reconciliation, restitution in the amnesty process. Yeah. And as you can see by Esidimeni, look what the lawyers did. Perfect. No social workers in that room, and look what happened. Okay? So that's all I got to say.
Can you come on my show tomorrow?
Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thanks, Lebohang. Sister Lebohang. Thank you so much for the brilliance. You know, this is a day, to me, I think yesterday when I spoke to Karima on 702, is that it's a commemoration, day of commemoration. And I feel very much, you know, angry sometimes of days like this, because we're not taking these days serious as we're supposed to be. We're not really commemorating this day the way we're supposed to commemorate it. And my question would be to Cyrilo. Why are the foundations there, for instance, the Mandela Foundation, so-called to the African people? When we try to get to those foundations, and many of them, the foundations that have been set up, or whether you call the Katrata Foundation, they are very cold if you are an African person. And secondly, it's about did we go to the trenches? Some of us come from the trenches. Lebohang knows this. And did we go to the trenches to come back and please the market as the media does it, that the markets are, you know, there are sometimes temperament, the markets are very prejudiced, the markets are this, because someone is this. We didn't go to fight to come and please the market. We came here to please, to actually service, deliver to the people of South Africa that suffered so much, like this day. But it seems we went to the trenches and people died. Some of our brothers and sisters are lying in the bushes. Their bones have never been given a decent burial. And that's why I would like to differ, or beg to differ with Karima when she says we're defeated. We're not defeated. The world agendas were ahead of us so that they can gain with the SOEs and all these state-owned and the resources of South Africa. They forced us to the compromising table. I think we have to sit down and reflect why we want to please the world instead of the people of South Africa.
Okay, make it very, very short, right? Because we're going to get in trouble. Hold on, who's got the mic? Yeah, but I'm still the MC, dude. Yes.
Okay, so earlier this year at school, we read this book, it's Purple Hibiscus, and in the book there's a term used called, like, someone being called a colonial product. And in class, one of the people I knew said that I was a colonial product because I'm a black South African who can only speak English and Afrikaans. All my friends are white, and that's basically what the colonialists want. They wanted a black person who was essentially a white person.
What languages do you speak?
It's English and Afrikaans.
Only English and Afrikaans?
Yeah, Afrikaans from school and English. So I wanted to ask, what does one do what does one like me, someone who feels that they're a colonial product, what do they do when they feel, what do they do for the cause of making the country better, equalizing like the grounds between the gap between black South Africans and disadvantaged individuals and those who are privileged?
I feel like giving you a hug, first of all. Okay, thank you for that question. I think there's some deep psychological stuff there. I'm going to take friendship liberties and instruct Sizwe to have a conversation with you and maybe even continue opening. I mean that seriously, and have that conversation. A lot of us that have gone to former whites-only schools have suffered profound psychological forms of violence, and I think that's what you've gone through.
I have a question for the panel and the audience. Is it possible that Mr. Mandela was used as a front or pawn for whites to give exposure to their ulterior motives in a way that would make blacks think and feel that they have won against the apartheid system because they wouldn't fight against Mandela as they looked up to him and believed in him?
Okay, thank you. Okay. And then the final comment for today, I'm sorry, it will be the last one. For old time's sake, a white person will have the last say.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask if you think that justice is achievable without violence, especially if the ideologies that you're trying to uproot, patriarchy and white supremacy, are specifically violent.
Of course, I shouldn't be presumptuous, eh? For all I know, he's transracial like Rachel Dolezal. I'm going to give you each a maximum of 90 seconds. Use it as you see fit. You can either make a statement. You don't have to make an argument. You can also just tell me how you're feeling. I was intellectually engaged in this conversation, and that last comment from that young black man who only speaks Afrikaans and English, it's taken me out of a cognitive space into an affective one. So for that reason, I actually want to shut up for the moment. We're going to start with Caesar.
Thanks very much. I think the first thing to remember is that we did win the freedom to express ourselves without necessarily being assassinated or going to jail, and we need to use those freedoms to expand the others. To the gentleman who asked, is it a seed or is it something that's been brought to fruition? there's a line that I'd like to leave you with. It said, if 94 was a flower, what's the sense in a seed if the seed never flowers? And what's the sense in a seed? I think that's something we really need to ask ourselves now. I'd like to end by just saying what I think the fundamental problem that I think stretches across many different comments is. And this is something that I've been canvassing in a lot of different discussions, and I'll leave with you because I think it relates to the gentleman's question as well. And that's that, it's going to be my next book, by the way, but it's that apartheid didn't die, it was privatized. And I think the problem we face now, and I really will end here, is that we underestimated the strategy. Having a racialized project of racial subjugation is really costly and really timeous. And I think the thinking was delegate that out and then privatize the system of racial subjugation. And that's why we see in private schools, that's why we see in insurance, that's why we see in banking, that's why we see in our interactions on a personal level, that's why we see AfriForum. Private power is subverting whatever goal we may have set. And so I would implore us as we reflect on this day, on this legacy, to continue the struggle, continue the fight, and go from seed to fruition. Thank you.
I like the idea that I'm lost for words because that's a good thing. I think for me it's really hard to be a South African because the challenges that we face don't have easy answers. They require a kind of honesty and reflection that is often against one's own class interest, perhaps your family interest, perhaps your generation's interest. So I find being a South African a very difficult thing. But I don't reject that difficulty. I embrace it because for me, the lessons from Nelson Mandela is not just that we could find the courage to fight. It was that we could find the courage to fight and win and get the possibility of creating a space in which we can reimagine our country. The struggle to bring about a just South Africa is a never-ending one. Our society is a mass of contradictions. There's intersectionality about being black, about being poor, about being working class, about being female, about being from a rural area. These struggles are not isolated. They need to be looked at in their complexity, in the intersectionality, and we need to also engage in such a way that we don't seek moral equivalence with our oppressors. For me, that is probably the most dangerous phenomena that I see in our current politics. I see an elite that wants to hark back to how the previous regime and the previous rulers ruled with impunity, without accountability, creating a state in their own image, which is why we can't ignore things like state capture. It's not separate from the fight against patriarchy. It's not separate from the fight against capitalism. We have a state that has the ability to represent us all, but it's always going to be a contestation. We must understand it for what it is. And there is no essential relationship between blackness and goodness. There's no essential relationship between young and having the corner on ideas, or being old and being wise. And we need to get out of our comfort zones. We need to really get to grips with what genuine transformation is about, because I bet you it's about ourselves giving up power as well.
So I'll pick up exactly where Karim has left off, which is, are we transforming or are we liberating? And I'd like to offer a provocation, which is that South Africa should not be viewed as an outpost in the vein of Australia, in the vein of New Zealand, in the vein of Canada. And this is really one of the, again, part of the mythology and the complexity that we're collectively curating, that South Africa is something exceptional and different. There's been a level of inoculation that we imagined would emerge because of the nature of our struggle, because of the nature of our transformation and of the transfer of power. Has power even been transferred in the effective, substantive, structural ways? And I think that I'd also like to suggest that we have been dislocated, intentionally so, from African realities. And this is why there's this whole thing of up north, those Africans, those people, as you were saying, sister, around how Nigerians and other people perceive us. There's nothing exceptional about being an exceptional South African. You can be an exceptional Nigerian, exceptional Kenyan, exceptional anything that you bloody well want to be. And I think that the question of this is also because we transformed, we didn't liberate. So we're living in a new South Africa which bears a horrible resemblance to the old one. In as much as I agree with Sizwe that it has given us the space to think. It has given us the space to organize. It has given us the space to regather our thoughts. And lastly, I think that reparations are not only economic. Reparations have to be multiple in response to the white compatriots in the audience. Reparations have to be not only economic, but they also have to be around ideas. Nobody is going to cede space. Privilege doesn't cede space easily. So the answer to the question is going to be violent, maybe. Yeah, maybe. Maybe there will be blood, maybe they won't. Maybe there will be displacement, maybe they won't. And I think that we have to allow for the fact that when you're in a liberation struggle, unlike a transformative process, it will be bloody, it might be unpredictable, and we don't know what the end product might be. But all we know that it will be different to what it is today. Rhodesia must become Zimbabwe. Gold Coast had to become Ghana. So South Africa has to become something else.
Firstly, I want to again express my gratitude for having been invited. Thank you very much. And this has been really inspirational for us to begin to listen to what South Africans think about Madiba's legacy. So to the two of you, thank you very much for the opportunity to have me invited. I thought I should thank you, Eusebius, the way you dealt with how the young lady was howled. I call it the legotification of our dialogues. And it's this legotification that we must guard against. Because if what Sizwe said about our constitutional space, creating these spaces for us to be free to express ourselves, we should never be howled down and called stupid. And I think that's important. And I think all of us collectively must vow that what happened earlier on will never happen again. The question of Madiba being a front, I had to sort of, because I hear this every time, and it suggests stupidity of the worst form for African people, that you can be a front to white people. And for me, it's like the lowest form of an insult for any person who, and I think it's important that that fronting needs to, if it ever existed, it needs to be understood with its context if it existed. So because it suggests there's no agency on the one who's been fronted. There was no thinking. One was just going through the motion because you are a front. So I'll leave it there, and I'll be happy to have a chat with the young person afterwards. The last two is that the perception of the foundation being called, I would like to deal with that offline, if you don't mind. Because I've heard the foundation is white run, and it's only 2 white people in the institution, so I'm not sure. So when you say, will you give statistics? No, but there's something else. So I'd rather not give stats here. The last one is a quote that I'd like to leave you with. Che Guevara said, live your life not celebrating victories, but overcoming defeats. And I think that moment is called for now. That all of us should not just be celebrating the victories that we've had, but doing the difficult work of what comes with defeats, which is to reimagine, to go back to base and say, how did we falter? And how do we correct? Because it's clear that doing the same is no longer an option. It's about doing differently. For us to even accept that 1 in 4 children, predominantly African children, suffer from stunted growth. And we are quiet when the Statistician General released those stats 2 weeks ago. Just left me with a sense of hollowness. So I think we should be horrified at things that will impact on how we poison the future by our silence today. Thank you.
I think it's particularly rare for both Karima and I to be at a loss of words on the same occasion because we get paid to talk and to have opinions. So this is going to be a very hasty vote of thanks and final comments. Wadi, if you can come up, please. So, Lebogang, this is a contested space. I must stop telling people, because they get annoyed with my self-reference, that I am both a liberal but deeply committed to racial justice in particular and left-wing politics. I would not put my name next to a series of events in a space that I think are part of a process of the epistemic erasure of the contributions of black people. People think they know what goes on in the Apartheid Museum. It has evolved. It is a contested space. And I can tell you that there's a massive overlap between your politics and the politics of Wadi and my own politics. She is responsible for fighting that fight in this institution. I can say things that she can't say as an employee of the Apartheid Museum. The Apartheid Museum is not what you might have thought it was 10 years ago. And part of the vision for this series of dialogues is also at a conceptual level to transform the idea of any museum as a place that is cold with artifacts into a space that is living and breathing, where we bring people to come and have contested and difficult conversations. So firstly, can we please thank the Apartheid Museum and Wadi in particular. We are not entitled to your presence, and we are certainly not entitled to both your presence and your active participation. Can you please be egotistical and give yourselves a round of applause? Second, lastly, I don't want to summate the debate. I am someone who loves imperfect cadences, and that's because there aren't perfect cadences in life. Even if your piano teacher told you that everything should end with a major cadence. And there's a sense in which this conversation has been beautifully jarring. Many of us will have different intellectual points that you will take home and spar with the folks that are journeying back with you. Many of you will have been engaged here. Some of you will have been engaged here. My moment came in that young man's question, or not so much question, but sharing the sense that maybe he is some sort of defect from colonialism, being phenotypically black and being fluent in English and Afrikaans, and no doubt, like many of us, the cultural grammar of whiteness. And that for me was a touch point. And I think that's okay. Like I said at the beginning, I'm not part of the school that is addicted to quick solutions, because the fetishizing of quick solutions usually come from a place of not wanting Tulani to sit and do that important process work. And actually our project, and I was so profoundly happy that Lebogang, with her attention to economics, was reinforcing the same point, has got to be multifaceted. There's a question of material justice that should be at the heart of the justice project, but there's also a psychosocial project that as a country we have not yet taken on board, and that is a process question. That is where people who are glib about the media get it wrong. There's something inherently productive, even if it is not the total project of justice, in gathering in a space where those of us who live disparate lives in different parts of the city can come together. Sometimes happens online, badly. Sometimes happens on the radio, badly. And what's beautiful about face-to-face dialogue is that we all become a little less arrogant, a bit more vulnerable, and a bit more thoughtful, which is why, as much as I love being a talk show host, I prefer the proverbial town hall format even better. There's something really real about looking each other in the eye, and I think it's important to sit with that discomfort. So if someone asks you, what was the conclusion of this thing you went to? There are no conclusions. If there were conclusions, we wouldn't be in this complicated country that Karima had said we are in, and we need to be comfortable with that discomfort. Last but not least, I want to invite you, not only the biggest event we've had, it might also be the first one where we will run out of food and drinks and stuff. Usually there's enough for at least one person to get drunk. I'm not sure about today. We'll see how that goes. Please travel back safely, and each one of them, I correctly predicted in my head, of course I can say so, not having disclosed it, where they will be situated in this debate. They made distinctive contributions, and I think we owe all of our panelists a round of applause. Okay, thank you so much. Please look out for future events. We will try and match it. It will be a hard one to follow. We've got at least 4 more for the rest of the year. Kindly travel back safely, and the conversation should continue. Thank you very much.